Buenos dias. I'm going to echo so many of the other presenters in expressing my gratitude to the conference organizers for the invitation and the hospitality. It is an honor to be able to present my work with these other scholars. In some ways, drawing on the remarks that Professor Penner made yesterday about the difficulties of historic periodization, my paper is an attempt to move beyond seeing Suarez as a kind of last expression of the Middle Ages and Locke as a beginning of early modern thought, and an attempt instead to bring them into a conversation that I hope can present us with a kind of alternative modernity for political thought by bringing their works together in a kind of fruitful discussion and I think in some ways a kind of corrective influence on each other. So as Professor Cujus has pointed out already, there is a kind of affinity between Suarez's political thought and other typical expressions of early modern political thought, in that he has this social contract model in his writings. And as a result of this, there's a kind of constitutionalism present in his political thought and a place for individual rights within the political community, and a place especially important for resistance to tyrannical government and the ability to either reorder or replace a problematic government. And so for these reasons, it's easy to see a kind of affinity between him and John Locke especially. Because these two men both describe a movement from something Locke will call a state of nature. Suarez does not describe it that way, but certainly a movement from an array of individuals and households into a political order. I think it is interesting to compare them and to look particularly at the mechanism of consent that they both deem so important to the formation of a political community. Both of them believe that consent is necessary for the creation of a political community. However, if we look at the way that they describe nature and the way that they describe the properties particular to human individuals, I think that the more interesting aspect in comparing their two systems is in some ways the opposing ways that individuals consent to enter a political community. Now, what I mean by that is that for Locke, in the state of nature, each individual possesses the executive power to enforce the law of nature. So this is very important for him because he believes that unless there is this executive power to enforce the law of nature would exist in vain. And so what happens when individuals come together to create a political community is they surrender this executive power of nature in order to create a government that then has that power to enforce the law. For Suarez, it is quite different. Instead, he says that individuals come together and by the act of consent that creates the political community, that power to enforce the law comes into existence at the same time as the political community. The reason that this is important is that it shows the different ways each man considers nature. For Locke, if you begin with each individual possessing the executive power of nature, it shows that nature for him is not a guide, it's not a destination. So there's no teleology in Locke. He has abandoned that method of political thought. Instead, each individual possesses kind of complete for himself or herself what makes them as an individual. There's a kind of completeness to them in the state of nature. For Suarez, it is political life that completes the human being. There is a natural end to human activity, and that is the political life. And so the creation of a political power, in some sense, reflects this, that when you enter into the political community, you become something more than you were. You are completed in some sense. Whereas for Locke, because when you enter the political community, you give up that executive power of nature, you become something less than you were before, it seems to me. You are not the complete individual that you were in the state of nature. So what's also particularly interesting about that is that Suarez actually considers the possibility that each individual person has that executive power of nature that they then surrender to the political community. And he rejects this as a possibility precisely on the grounds that each individual is free and equal before they enter into political society. He says that it's not possible that you could have the power to enforce the law of nature on another person as an individual because of the natural equality and freedom of human beings. Whereas for Locke, on the exact same grounds, he thinks that each person does have that ability to enforce the law of nature because they are free and equal in the state of nature. So if we consider the political consequences then, what happens if you consider a human being to be a kind of complete whole before they enter a political community versus a person with a kind of natural end and direction guided toward political life? So in my paper, I consider what would happen with two natural rights, property and liberty. For property, I think there are a couple of important consequences for Locke. One is, this is a pre-political right for Locke. So before you enter the political community, you have a natural right to your property that you acquire from nature. The other important consideration, I think, is that his attitude, if you look at chapter 5 of the second treatise on government, if you look at the way that he develops his idea of property, he begins with an idea of nature as this kind of bounty. Well, he almost describes it as a bounty, certainly a gift, that you are able to wander throughout nature and gather what you need and leave as good and enough for others. But that if you look at the way that the chapter develops, you move from that idea of a kind of enough and as good for everyone at the beginning to the end, where he begins to describe nature as, quote, almost worthless, right? That you actually have to work on nature a considerable amount in order to extract what you need. And I see in this a kind of interesting parallel to the political condition, or to the state of politics, basically, that in the same way that nature doesn't actually provide us enough, that we have to work on nature, we have to force nature to give us as much as we need. This seems similar in some way, I think, to the way that the state of nature is described as this kind of perilous, uneasy condition that we leave because we can't actually live very well in that condition. So nature, it turns out, rather than being this kind of guide or direction or goal for human beings, is rather a point of departure and in many ways a kind of obstacle to be overcome. That we need to work on nature, we need to overcome it to a certain extent in order to live in peace and certainly in order to provide enough for ourselves. Suarez, although he does think that it is in some sense natural to human beings to acquire property, in his work on the 6 days, he actually uses an example that is somewhat similar to Locke in that he talks about gathering fruit and the way in which gathering that fruit does make it yours. In some sense, it would be wrong to be deprived of the fruit of your labors, but he describes it more in terms of a right to use. So it would be wrong if you were deprived of the use of that fruit that you've gathered, but he doesn't speak of it in that sense of property, that really absolute exclusive right that Locke is talking about in the state of nature. So for Suarez, property is really a post-political right. And it would always be guided and kind of conditioned by the laws of the community. So this is a very important difference between them on this right to property. They both think that it is natural in some sense to human beings, but for Locke it's pre-political, for Suarez it's post-political. On the question of freedom, this is another interesting difference between them. So one of the papers yesterday mentioned that Suarez has this idea that you can voluntarily give up your freedom, that you can enter into a condition of slavery. And in some ways, this might make intuitive sense to us if we think about the state having the power to punish criminals, to imprison them. So in that sense, you've given up your liberty. But he goes beyond this in a certain way. So he says, yes, the state has the power to imprison criminals, and yes, you actually do have the ability to alienate your own liberty, because otherwise you wouldn't have true dominion over it. But he actually goes a bit farther than you might expect. So when in his treatise on faith, hope, and charity, in the section on charity, he spends a good deal talking about sort of rules of war. And it turns out that if there is a just war, and the just side prevails, they may enslave the population of the city or community that was on the wrong side. And that includes not only the combatants that they were fighting with, but also the innocent bystanders, the non-combatants. By virtue of these people's citizenship in the unjust side, they can become part of the spoils of war. So he says, it is permissible to deprive the innocent of their goods and even of their liberty. The reason is that the innocent form a portion of one whole and unjust state. And on account of the crime of the whole, this part may be punished, even though it does not in itself share the fault. So this line of reasoning here draws explicitly on his belief that human beings exist importantly as parts of a whole, and may even be best understood as parts of a whole. In this scenario, I think the results are a little troubling. In the face of collective guilt, the individual innocence of even a large group of people cannot save them from a loss of this fundamental natural human good of liberty. And one of the reasons this is particularly interesting is that Locke mentions the exact same example in the second treatise on nature and comes to the opposite conclusion. You cannot enslave non-combatants, even if it is a just war. And the reason is precisely because he's able to distinguish between those who actively take part in the war and those who do not. And I believe that his ability to pick and choose which persons are then guilty and then able to be enslaved because of the way that he views people, primarily first as these kind of individuals that have an integrity of their own apart from their membership in the political community. So, with these two political issues of property and liberty, I think that we can maybe offer a Lockean modification of Suarez's account of freedom. So, although it might be true that people live their best life in communion and participation with others, and in this sense can best be understood as parts of a whole, we must also recognize that human beings are not like any other part of a whole, because each human being embodies a certain kind of unified whole already. Greater concern for the kind of unity each person embodies within the whole should direct our attention toward a conversation about universal human rights, irrespective of the communities we inhabit. With Locke, we might say there are certain qualities natural to human beings that simply cannot be absorbed into the community or sacrificed because of the actions of the community, even if we could maintain with Suarez that human individuals cannot finally be defined apart from each other. The Suarezian modification of Locke's politics, on the other hand, would be that human rights apart from a destination and a shared purpose in political life are simply insufficient. Without a direction for the community and a deferential posture toward nature as guide that can limit the attempt to modify and adapt the natural world to our needs, we might expect not only inequitable distribution of land, but also environmental degradation. If our stance toward nature is adversarial, viewing nature as an obstacle to our comfort and happiness, there is no authoritative reason to try to preserve something of the natural world's integrity against our strong needs and desires. The Lockean individual is, and quote from Locke, the absolute lord of his own person and possessions. That's his description of the individual in the state of nature. A total whole that is able to act over and against other individuals and nature itself in the quest to exercise his liberty and protect his personal property. Suarez teaches us that the individual is not such an absolute whole, but rather receives important guidance and direction from nature and from others in political community. If Locke were to see the political community less as a vehicle for the elimination of natural obstacles, as more as the fulfillment of human potential for shared rational activity, then he might have more generosity toward other forms of political community. So in my paper, I mention his stance toward the Americas and his kind of troubling comment about America as an example of the state of nature, even though he also acknowledges that there are societies there. I think this is partly due to his attitude towards the necessity of enclosure and the connection he makes between enclosure, monetization, and property, and the failure of people in America to do these things. Suarez's comparatively modest comments on property allow for a more flexible understanding of what is already owned and what a community has in fact spoken for. So what these thinkers teach us then is twofold. We each possess a precious singularity that should be part of the conversation that creates a system of laws and political order, but we also live for an end, and the ability to discern hierarchies of goods in pursuit of this end is truly the only thing that can direct our infinite desire to modify nature for our benefit and to acquire those things that make life pleasant and bearable. Properly speaking, these goals work with each other quite well. Attention to individual human rights is part of directing a political community toward fulfilling its purpose, and those same rights, once articulated, should receive their best protection from the common good of the political community. And so, while not exactly complementary thinkers, Suarez and Locke represent an important chance to recognize what we instinctively hope for in political life as inheritors of classical, medieval, and modern political thought. Thank you.